I've never been very lucky. When I was 5, I fell into a well during a family picnic. At 12, I broke both arms trying to prove that I could fly by jumping off of our garage roof. At 16, I crashed my first car the day after getting my license. And when I turned 21 last month, I lost my apartment, my girlfriend, and my college scholarship all in the same week. So when I saw the help wanted sign in the grimy window of Gustav's Fine Dining, I wasn't exactly expecting my luck to change. I just needed a job, any job, because 3 weeks of sleeping in my Honda Civic had me desperate enough to try anything. The restaurant itself didn't look promising, tucked between an abandoned laundromat and a pawn shop in the worst part of town. Its weathered brick exterior and flickering neon sign screamed, "Health Code Violation." The windows were tinted so dark that they were nearly black, and the heavy wooden door had more locks than seemed necessary for any legitimate business. But beggars can't be choosers, and so I pulled open the door and I stepped inside. The interior was nothing like I expected. Where I anticipated sticky floors and cockroaches, I found polished mahogany and crisp white tablecloths. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling that seemed impossibly high for the building's exterior dimensions. The air smelled of something that I couldn't quite place. An odd mixture of expensive perfume, rare spices, and something metallic and raw. The host who had greeted me was immaculately dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire car. He was tall, unnaturally so, with skin so pale that it was almost translucent. When he smiled, his teeth seemed just a bit too numerous, too sharp. "May I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying a strange accent that I couldn't place. "I saw the sign," I replied, suddenly feeling underdressed in my worn jeans and faded t-shirt. "About the job." His smile widened, revealing even more of those unsettling teeth. "Ah, excellent. We've been searching for a new attendant. Follow me, please." He led me through the dining room, which was empty despite it being dinner time. I noticed the tables were arranged in peculiar configurations, some absurdly large and others bizarrely small. Some had chairs that looked normal enough, while others had what appeared to be custom furnishings, reinforced benches, unusually high stools, and what looked like cushioned troughs. We passed through a set of swinging doors into a kitchen that gleamed with stainless steel and state-of-the-art equipment. But something was off. The knives were too large, the freezer secured with heavy padlocks, and there were strange symbols etched into the handles of pots and pans. In a small office off the kitchen sat a man who I assumed was Gustav himself. He looked ordinary enough, middle-aged, slightly overweight, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. It was his eyes that gave me pause. They were entirely black, no whites visible at all. "This is the applicant, sir," the host announced before gliding out and closing the door behind him. Gustav gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. "You need work," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "And you're desperate." Again, not a question. I swallowed hard. "I am." He nodded as if confirming something to himself. "The position pays well, very well. $500 per night, cash. No taxes, no paperwork." My heart raced. That kind of money would get me back on my feet in no time. But there had to be a catch. "What would I be doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Gustav leaned forward. "Serving, cleaning, basic restaurant duties. Nothing complicated." "That's it? For $500 a night?" He smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his pitch-black eyes. "The job has its challenges. Our clientele is exclusive. They have unique needs and expectations. Oh, like celebrities or something. He chuckled. A dry sound like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. Or something. You'll work from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., Wednesday through Sunday. You'll receive specific instructions which you must follow precisely. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. These are the rules. Memorize them. I looked down at the page. Written in elegant script were 5 numbered rules. Rule number 1, never look the customers directly in the eyes. Rule number 2, never touch the customers, even if asked. Rule number 3, never consume anything on the premises. Rule number 4, never enter the basement. Rule number 5, never under any circumstances remain in the building after 4:05 a.m. Simple enough, I thought. Weird, but simple. So, do you accept the position? And Gustav asked. Common sense told me to walk away. Something was clearly off about this place, but the thought of another night sleeping in my car or having to drop out of college permanently, of never getting my life back on track, it all outweighed my apprehension. I accept, I said, sealing my fate. And Gustav's smile widened. Excellent. You start tonight. My first night at Gustav's began with a uniform, a crisp white shirt, black vest, and black pants that fit me perfectly, though I didn't recall giving anybody my measurements. The host, who introduced himself as Reginald, gave me a brief tour of the restaurant, pointing out the dining areas, the bathrooms, which had strange symbols on the doors instead of the usual indicators, and the kitchen. You'll primarily be clearing tables and assisting our regular servers, he explained. Under no circumstances are you to take orders directly from the customers. Why not? I asked. Reginald's expression tightened. Rule number 2, never touch the customers even if asked. Taking orders often involves physical interaction. Our regular staff are better equipped to handle such situations. I nodded, though his explanation raised more questions than it answered. At precisely 10 p.m., the first customers arrived. I heard them before I saw them. A strange shuffling sound accompanied by what seemed like the clicking of multiple hard-soled shoes on the marble floor. When I turned to look, though, I felt my blood run cold. What entered the restaurant was not human, not even close. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with skin like polished obsidian. It moved on 4 backward jointed legs while 2 long arms ended in hands with far too many fingers. Its head was elongated with no visible eyes or nose, just a wide slit where a mouth should be. I quickly averted my gaze, remembering rule number 1. My heart hammered in my chest and I had to grip the edge of the table that I had been clearing to keep from collapsing. Reginald glided forward, bowing deeply to the creature. Your usual table, honored guest. The thing made a series of clicking noises that somehow Reginald seemed to understand. He led it to a large circular table in the corner, where the chair had been replaced by what looked like a nest of cushions on the floor. As the night progressed, more customers arrived. Some were vaguely humanoid while others defied description entirely. There was a pair of small, childlike beings whose skin seemed to shift and ripple like water. A massive, bulbous entity that exuded a sweet, rotting smell. And a trio of what looked like ordinary businessmen, until they removed their hats to reveal spiraling horns. I kept my head down, focusing on my tasks. I cleared dishes containing half-eaten meals that looked nothing like food should look. I wiped tables clean of substances that moved on their own accord. I carried trays of drinks that glowed, smoked, or sometimes seemed to whisper. And through it all, I carefully followed the rules. When one of the customers, a spindly, multi-armed creature with skin like parchment, tried to make eye contact, I immediately looked at the floor. When another, a being seemingly composed entirely of writhing shadows, extended what might have been a hand toward me, I stepped back, maintaining distance. When Reginald offered me a glass of what he called the house specialty, a crimson liquid that pulsed like a heartbeat, I politely declined. When I accidentally dropped a tray near a door marked with a symbol I recognized as leading to the basement, I quickly retreated without investigating the strange sounds emanating from below. And when the antique clock in the dining room struck 4 a.m., I helped with final cleanup, changed back into my regular clothes, and I was out the door by 4:03. As promised, Gustav handed me 5 crisp $100 bills as I left. "You did well for your first night," he said. "Return tomorrow." I nodded, too shocked by what I had experienced to speak. As I walked to my car, I kept expecting to wake up. I mean, this had to be a dream. A bizarre, terrifying dream brought on by stress and sleeping in a cramped vehicle. But the money in my pocket was real, and so it seemed was everything else. By my 3rd night at Gustav's, I had almost adjusted to the strangeness. Almost. I had found a cheap motel room with the money that I had earned, giving me a real bed to sleep in during the day. I was beginning to recognize some of the regulars at the restaurant, and I had developed a system for avoiding direct eye contact while still being able to do my job efficiently. That night, a new customer arrived, if you could even call it that. It entered the restaurant not through the door but by seeping through the floorboards like black oil. It coalesced into a roughly humanoid shape, though its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, torso too thin, neck bending at impossible angles. Reginald greeted it with the same professional courtesy that he showed all guests, leading it to a secluded booth in the far corner. Throughout the evening, I noticed him delivering plate after plate to this customer, each one piled high with what looked like raw meat. As I was clearing nearby tables, I accidentally knocked over a glass, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound caused the oil-like entity to turn sharply in my direction. For a brief moment, our eyes met, or rather, my eyes met the empty voids where its eyes should have been. I quickly looked away, remembering rule number 1, but it was too late. I felt a strange pressure in my head, like someone was squeezing my brain. The room started to spin, and I had to grab the edge of a table to steady myself. "Excuse me," I mumbled, hurrying toward the kitchen. I pushed through the swinging doors and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My vision swam, and strange whispers echoed in my ears, words in a language that I had never heard but somehow almost understood. "You broke rule number 1, came a voice beside me. It was one of the regular servers, a woman named Lydia. Unlike Reginald and Gustav, she appeared completely human, petite with short blonde hair and green eyes. But there was something about her that still seemed off, though I couldn't put my finger on what. It was an accident. She handed me a small vial containing a blue liquid. "Drink this, it'll help." I hesitated, remembering rule number 3, never consume anything on the premises. "It's medicine, not food," she explained, as if reading my thoughts. "An exception to rule number 3. Otherwise, you're not going to make it through your shift." Desperation won out. I uncorked the vial and downed its contents in one gulp. It tasted like mint and something metallic, but the effect was immediate. The pressure in my head subsided and the whispers faded. "Better?" Lydia asked. I nodded. "What was that thing? And what did it do to me?" "Oh, Mr. Thorne is a valued customer," she replied carefully. "His gaze can be intrusive. He likes to know who's serving him." "No, like read my mind." Lydia's expression became guarded. "You should get back to work and be more careful with the rules." I returned to the dining room, making a wide berth around Mr. Thorne's table. For the rest of the night, I could feel this attention on me, like icy fingers probing at the back of my skull. When 4 a.m. finally came, I changed and left as quickly as possible. In the parking lot, I noticed a dark, oil-like substance seeping under my car door. By the time that I reached the vehicle, it was gone, but a lingering smell like rotting flowers and copper hung in the air. That night, I dreamed of Mr. Thorne. In the dream, he stood over my bed, his form rippling and shifting, while he whispered words that made the air itself seem to curdle. I woke up drenched in sweat, with the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone in my motel room. But by then, it was nearly time for my next shift. "You've attracted attention," Gustav said on my 5th night as he handed me my uniform. "That's both good and bad." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. "Some of our patrons are collectors of experiences, of sensations, of humans who intrigue them." He straightened my vest with hands that felt too cool and too smooth. "Mr. Thorne has expressed an interest in you." My stomach dropped. What kind of interest? "He's invited you to join him at his table tonight, as a guest, not a server." "I can't," I said quickly. "Rule number 2. "It would not apply in this case," Gustav interrupted. "You would be a guest, not an employee, for that portion of the evening." "And if I refuse?" Gustav's black eyes glittered. "That would be unwise. Mr. Thorne is not accustomed to rejection. Besides, you struck up this relationship by breaking rule number 1. Actions have consequences." I thought about quitting on the spot. I had enough money saved now to get by for a little while, but something in Gustav's expression told me that walking away might not be as simple as turning in my uniform. "What would I have to do?" I asked finally. "Just sit, converse. Mr. Thorne enjoys learning about humans, their hopes, their fears." Gustav smiled that not quite right smile. "Their nightmares." That evening at precisely midnight, Reginald escorted me to Mr. Thorne's table. The entity had taken on a more defined form than previous nights, almost human but with proportions that remained subtly wrong. He wore what appeared to be an expensive suit that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. "Please sit," he said, his voice a disconcerting blend of multiple tones speaking at once. I sat across from him, careful to keep my eyes on the tablecloth. "You may look at me," Mr. Thorne said. "I've given permission. The rules are suspended between us for now." Reluctantly, I raised my gaze. What I had taken for a featureless face now had definition. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and eyes like black holes, pulling in all light without revealing anything of what lay behind them. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Your fears in particular." I swallowed hard. "I'm just an ordinary person. I don't have any interesting fears." Mr. Thorne's mouth curved into what might have been a smile. "Everyone fears something. Death, failure, loneliness." He leaned forward slightly. "Being trapped." As he spoke that last word, I felt a sensation like spiderwebs brushing against my mind. Memories surfaced unbidden. Being stuck in that well when I was 5, the darkness closing in, the air growing thin, screaming until my voice gave out. "Ah," Mr. Thorne whispered. "Confinement, suffocation, the terror of being aware as the last breath leaves your body." He made a sound like satisfaction. "Delicious." I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if invisible restraints held me in place. "Our conversation isn't finished," Mr. Thorne said mildly. "I barely tasted your fear." Please, I managed to say. I need to get back to work. Work can wait. Gustav understands the importance of keeping patrons like me satisfied. For what felt like hours, Mr. Thorne sifted through my memories, pulling out moments of terror, embarrassment, and dread, savoring them like fine wine. By the time he released me, I felt violated in a way I couldn't articulate, as if he had reached inside me and rearranged my thoughts. You may go, he said finally, but I'll see you again soon. I stumbled back to the kitchen where Lydia was waiting with another vial of blue liquid. Drink, she instructed, all of it. This time I didn't hesitate. The liquid burned going down, but it cleared my head and steadied my shaking hands. What does he want from me? I asked her. Lydia's expression was sympathetic but resigned. What they all want, in one form or another. Sustenance. He feeds on fear. Mr. Thorne specializes in fear, yes. Others prefer different emotions, or physical sensations. She touched my arm lightly. Be careful. Once they develop a taste for you, it's difficult to break free. That night, as I left the restaurant, I found a small, oil-like puddle by my car door again. And when I returned to my motel room, all the furniture had been subtly rearranged, everything just a few inches from where I had left it. The message was clear. Mr. Thorne could reach me anywhere. On my 10th night at Gustav's, I broke rule number 4. It wasn't intentional. I was carrying a tray of dirty dishes to the kitchen when I tripped over something, a tail or a tentacle, I wasn't sure, that extended into the aisle from under one of the tables. The tray went flying and I stumbled backward, crashing through a door that I hadn't noticed before. I found myself at the top of a staircase leading down into darkness, the basement. I knew that I should turn around immediately, but curiosity, that fatal human flaw, got the better of me. From below came strange sounds, rhythmic chanting, a wet slithering noise, and what might have been screams, though they sounded distorted, as if coming from underwater. Slowly, silently, I descended a few steps, just enough to peer into the gloom. What I saw made my blood freeze. The basement was vast, far larger than it should have been possible given the dimensions of the building above. It was lit by hundreds of candles that burned with an unnatural blue-tinged light. In the center of the space was a pit, and gathered around it were figures in hooded robes, some with distinctly non-human shapes beneath the fabric. They were engaged in some kind of ritual, chanting in the same strange language that I had heard in my head after meeting Mr. Thorne's gaze. And suspended over the pit was a man, an ordinary human like me, bound in what looked like living ropes that pulsed and tightened with each verse of the chant. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, because suddenly every hooded figure turned in my direction. The chanting stopped, and from the pit rose something that defied any description, a mass of writhing appendages surrounding a gaping maw lined with row upon row of needle-like teeth. I ran up the stairs, through the dining room, past startled customers, out the front door and into the night. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, terror making my hand shake so badly that I could barely put the key into the ignition. As I finally started the engine, I looked up to see Gustav standing in the restaurant doorway watching me. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, as if I were a promising student who had failed an important test. I drove straight to my motel, threw my few possessions into my backpack and checked out. I drove all night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Gustav's fine dining. By the morning, I was 3 states away, exhausted but alive. I found another cheap motel and I collapsed onto the bed, hoping against hope that I had escaped whatever horror that I had witnessed. But as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I noticed something on the nightstand that hadn't been there when I had entered the room. A folded piece of paper with my name written on it in elegant script. With trembling hands, I unfolded it to find a message. "You broke rule number 4. There are consequences for such actions, but we are not unreasonable. Return to your position and all will be forgiven. Refuse and will be forced to collect what you owe in other ways. Your shift begins at 10 p.m. We expect punctuality. G." Beneath the message was an address, the address of the motel where I now stayed. They had found me somehow. They had found me within hours of my flight. I considered running again, but what was the point? If they could track me across 3 states in a matter of hours, then where could I possibly hide? That night at 9:45 p.m., I pulled into the parking lot of Gustav's Fine Dining, defeated and terrified. And Gustav was waiting at the door. "A wise decision," he said, holding out my uniform. "Mr. Thorne was particularly displeased by your departure. He's developed quite an appetite for your specific brand of fear." "What I saw in the basement," I began, "is none of your concern." Gustav cut me off. "You broke a rule and you've been given a second chance. Don't squander it." His black eyes bored into mine. "There won't be a third." 3 weeks had passed since my failed escape attempt. 3 weeks of serving inhuman customers, of feeling Mr. Thorne sifting through my fears like a child digging through a toy box, of wondering what exactly happened in the basement during those mysterious rituals. I had given up on running. Where would I go? How could I hide from creatures that could seep through floorboards and invade my dreams? Instead, I focused on survival, following the rules, keeping my head down and saving money. But on this particular night, something was different. The restaurant was busier than usual with customers that I had never seen before. The air hummed with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "What's happening?" I asked Lydia as we passed in the kitchen. "The feast," she replied, her voice hushed. "It happens once a year." "What kind of feast?" Her eyes darted around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Just be careful tonight. Follow the rules to the letter." Throughout the evening, more and more patrons arrived, each stranger than the last. Some barely fit through the doors and others seemed to exist partially in dimensions that I couldn't perceive, with sections of their bodies disappearing and reappearing at random intervals. At precisely midnight, Reginald struck a gong that reverberated through the restaurant with a sound that felt more like a physical force than a noise. The customers fell silent. Gustav emerged from his office, but he looked different. Taller, his skin now definitely green-tinged, those black eyes now glowing faintly. He wore a ceremonial robe similar to those that I had seen in the basement. "Honored guests," he announced, his voice carrying an authority that I hadn't heard before. "The time of the feast approaches. Our offering has been prepared. Please, proceed to the chamber." To my horror, the customers began moving toward the basement door, which now stood wide open. Gustav caught my eye and beckoned me forward. "You'll assist with serving during the feast," he said. "But rule number 4, I stammered. "Is suspended for tonight only," he finished. "Your presence is required." Reginald handed me a small golden tray bearing a single crystal goblet filled with a dark liquid that moved of its own accord. "Do not spill a drop," he instructed, "and whatever you see, whatever you hear, maintain your composure. The consequences for disrupting the feast are severe." Heart pounding, I followed the procession down the basement stairs. The space had been transformed since I had glimpsed it weeks ago. Now it glittered with bizarre decorations. What looked like constellations of tiny lights floating in midair, strange symbols that shifted and changed when viewed from different angles, and streamers made of what appeared to be living tissue that pulsed with vibrant colors. The pit in the center was now covered by an intricate metal grate, and atop it stood a stone altar. And strapped to that altar was a man, different from the one that I had seen before, but in the same terrible situation. Unlike me, this man wasn't an employee. He wore expensive clothes and now torn and soiled. His face was bruised and his eyes were wild with terror. A gag prevented him from screaming, but his body strained against the restraints that held him down. "Behold our offering," Gustav announced. "Harold Whitmore, who built his fortune by destroying the sacred grounds where many of you once dwelled, who knowingly tore down the veil between worlds at 17 sites across this continent, who laughed when warned of the consequences of his actions." A murmur ran through the crowd, a blend of clicks, hisses, and sounds that no human throat could produce. "Tonight he pays his debt," Gustav continued. "Tonight he feeds us all." I stood frozen, the goblet trembling in my hands, as Gustav produced a curved knife that gleamed not with reflected light, but with its own inner glow. "Wait," I said, the word escaping before I could stop it. The room fell silent. Every inhuman eye turned to me. Gustav's expression darkened. "You forget yourself, attendant." "You can't just kill him," I protested. "Kill?" Gustav looked genuinely puzzled. No one spoke of killing. He gestured toward the struggling man. "Harold will experience the consequences of his actions. He will nourish our patrons. But when the sun rises, he will return to his life physically unharmed." "Then what are you going to do to him?" "We feast on essence, not flesh," came a familiar, multi-toned voice. Mr. Thorne glided forward, his form more amorphous than usual, edges blurring into the shadows. "Fear, pain, regret, remorse. The emotions humans produce so abundantly. When extracted properly," Gustav added, "these essences regenerate. Harold will leave with no memory of tonight, only a lingering sense of atonement." I wasn't sure that I believed them, but I was in no position to argue. Not surrounded by countless inhuman entities, deep in a basement that defied the laws of physics, holding a goblet of what I now realized was probably not wine. The ritual began. Gustav used the knife not to cut Harold's flesh, but to make precise movements in the air above him. With each gesture, he drew out something visible, colorful wisps of energy that coalesced in the space above the altar. As these essences gathered, the patrons moved forward one by one, each consuming their preferred emotion. Some inhaled deeply, drawing the energy into themselves. Others extended appendages that absorbed the essences on contact. A few simply stood near the floating colors, seeming to derive nourishment from proximity alone. I watched in horrified fascination as Harold's expressions changed with each extraction. Terror giving way to sorrow and then rage, and then a blank emptiness before the cycle began again. When my turn came to participate, I hesitated. "Offer the goblet to Mr. Thorne," Reginald whispered from behind me. "It's why you were brought here tonight." I approached the oil-like entity holding out the tray. Mr. Thorne's form solidified enough to grasp the goblet, which he raised in a toast-like gesture toward me. "Your contribution to tonight's feast is most appreciated," his voice somehow inside my head rather than in the air between us. "A few drops of your exceptional fear freely given add a delicate flavor that cannot be extracted by force." I realized with a jolt that the moving liquid in the goblet had come from me, harvested perhaps during my sleepless nights, my tension-filled shifts, or my nightmares of being trapped in that well. Mr. Thorne consumed the contents in one fluid motion, his form briefly taking on a blue glow that matched the color of the liquid. I felt a corresponding drain in my energy, as if a part of me had been consumed along with my bottled fear. The feast continued until nearly 4 a.m. By then, Harold lay still on the altar, not unconscious but empty, a vessel temporarily drained of all emotion. Gustav made a final gesture with the knife and the restraints fell away. "Return him," he ordered 2 robed figures. "As promised, he will remember nothing." As the guests filed out of the basement, satiated and in some cases visibly larger than when they had entered, Gustav approached me. "You did well tonight," he said. "Few humans witness the feast and maintain their composure." "Do I have a choice?" I asked bitterly. "There are always choices." He handed me my payment, not the usual 500 but 1,000. "Tonight you graduated from simple server to participant. Your value to the establishment has increased accordingly." I took the money feeling somehow complicit in whatever had happened to Harold Whitmore. "And one last thing," Gustav added. "Rule 5 is very important tonight. The energies stirred by the feast take time to settle. After 4:05, this place belongs to entities far less restrained than our usual clientele." I nodded, already planning to be out the door by 4:01. As I left that night, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten, I saw a black town car pull away from the alley behind the restaurant. Through its tinted windows, I caught a glimpse of Harold Whitmore, slumped but alive, being returned to his world, just as Gustav had promised. I wondered how many other powerful people had found themselves on that altar, paying for sins they couldn't even remember committing. And I wondered if someday I might find myself there too, not as a witness, but as an offering. 2 months had passed since the feast. My role at Gustav's had evolved. I was now trusted with more responsibilities, including helping prepare special orders in the kitchen, and occasionally translating for human guests who somehow found their way into the restaurant. Yes, there were human customers, rare but not unheard of. Most seemed to be occultists or thrill seekers who had learned of the restaurant through whispers in certain circles. They were treated with cautious courtesy, served mundane food and drink, and kept well away from the more dangerous patrons. I had even developed a sort of routine. I slept during the day in an apartment that I had rented with my money. I arrived at work each night at 9:30, donned my increasingly elaborate uniform, which now included strange symbols embroidered on the cuffs and collar, and I performed my duties with a professionalism that had earned me Gustav's approval. Mr. Thorne still requested my company once a week, still fed on my fears, but our sessions had developed an almost cordial quality. He no longer needed to restrain me or force his way into my mind. I had learned that resistance only made the experience more painful. I told myself that I was adapting, surviving, but deep down I knew the truth. I was becoming part of the restaurant, just another fixture in Gustav's strange menagerie. So that night began like any other. I served impossible dishes to impossible customers. I avoided eye contact, maintained professional distance, and I consumed nothing but the occasional medicinal blue liquid when the proximity to certain entities became too disorienting. But at approximately 2 a.m., something unprecedented happened. A raid. They burst through the front and back doors simultaneously, a dozen men and women in tactical gear wielding weapons and strange devices that emitted pulsing lights. They weren't police, their uniforms bore no insignia, just a simple symbol that matched one of the many etched into the kitchen equipment. Department of Extra-Dimensional Containment, their leader announced, her voice amplified by some unseen means. All human personnel stand down. All non-terrestrial entities are hereby ordered to return to their plane of origin immediately. Chaos erupted. Some customers fled, their forms dissolving into mist, light, or nothingness. Others stood their ground, transforming into combat-ready configurations that made their previous appearances seem almost mundane by comparison. Gustav emerged from his office, his form now fully inhuman, towering, multi-limbed, his skin a mosaic of shifting patterns. "You dare," he roared, his voice shaking the chandelier. "This establishment exists under the protection of the Seventh Covenant. The Covenant was broken when you began targeting specific humans for emotional harvest," the leader replied. Harold Whitmore filed a complaint. I gaped in shock. Harold remembered. But Gustav had said. One of the agents spotted me. "Human," she shouted. "Get down." Before I could react, something grabbed me from behind. Reginald, his form also transformed, elongated arms wrapping around me like constrictors. "The human stays," he hissed. "He is bound to us now." What followed was bedlam. Flashes of light, sounds that defied description, screams both human and otherwise. I saw agents thrown across the room by invisible forces. I saw creatures that I had served for months reveal their true forms and the true extent of their powers. And through it all, Reginald dragged me toward the basement door. "Rule 5, he kept saying. "It's almost 4 a.m. We must secure you before then." I struggled against his grip, but his strength was inhuman. "Let me go," I shouted. "I'm not bound to you, I'm just an employee." "Foolish child," Reginald hissed in my ear. "Do you think the money was all that you were earning? Every night you worked here, every rule you followed or broken, every interaction with your patrons, especially your sessions with Mr. Thorne, they all have bound you to this place. Your essence is interwoven with the restaurant now." We reached the basement door, but before Reginald could open it, a blinding light engulfed us. One of the agents had fired some kind of energy weapon. Reginald's grip loosened as he shrieked, a sound like metal being torn apart, and I broke free. I ran toward the front door, dodging the chaos. An agent grabbed my arm. "This way," she shouted, pulling me toward the exit. Just as we had reached the door, a familiar oil-like substance seeped up through the floorboards. Mr. Thorne blocked our path. "This one belongs to me," he said, his voice causing the agent to stagger back, hands covering her ears. "No," I said, surprising myself with my defiance. "I don't belong to anyone." Mr. Thorne's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "After all this time, still so delightfully afraid. But now there's something new mixed in. Courage. How tantalizing." The agent recovered and raised her weapon. "Back off," she warned. Mr. Thorne ignored her, his attention fixed on me. "You've been such a reliable source of nourishment. I'm not ready to give that up." "Too bad," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I quit." I lunged past him, expecting to feel his cold grip catch me. Instead, I heard the agent's weapon discharge, and Mr. Thorne's form dispersed into droplets that scattered across the floor. "He'll reform," the agent said, pulling me through the doorway. "We need to move." Outside, more agents were creating some kind of perimeter around the building. Strange devices had been placed at intervals, generating a barely visible field that shimmered in the night air. "What's happening?" I asked as the agent led me to a black van parked across the street. "Containment protocol," she explained. "We're sealing the breach between dimensions that Gustav's restaurant represents. But the customers will be forced back to their native realms when we collapse the dimensional pocket." She looked at her watch. "Which needs to happen in the next 3 minutes. A chill ran through me. "Before 4:05, I whispered. She shot me a sharp look. "You know about that. Rule number 5, never remain in the building after 4:05 a.m. "Smart rule," she nodded. "When the clock strikes 4:05, the veil between dimensions is at its thinnest. That's when we strike." Other humans were being evacuated from the building, kitchen staff I recognized. a few human customers looking dazed and terrified, but I didn't see Lydia among them. "There's someone still inside," I said. "A server named Lydia, she helped me." The agent's expression hardened. "There's no human server named Lydia. All staff have been accounted for." "But she..." I stopped as realization dawned. "She seems so normal." "Many of them can appear human when it suits them," the agent said. "It's part of their mimicry." A commotion near the restaurant entrance caught our attention. Gustav himself emerged, still in his transformed state but now restrained by what looked like glowing chains. It took 6 agents to control him. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice somehow reaching us despite the distance. "The Covenant protects us. There will be consequences." The agent beside me checked her watch again. 2 minutes, she muttered. As we watched, more creatures fled the building, some flying, others burrowing into the ground, a few simply vanishing with a pop of displaced air. The agents made no move to stop them, focusing instead on maintaining the perimeter. "Why aren't you stopping them?" I asked. "Our mission was containment, not capture," she explained. "We just need to close the breach that Gustav created. The entities themselves will be dealt with by other departments if they choose to remain in this plane." "And what about me? What happens to me now?" She gave me an assessing look. "Debriefing, medical evaluation, possible relocation with a new identity, depending on the extent of your involvement." "I was just a server," I protested. "I needed the money." "Nobody works at a place like Gustav's for 2 months without becoming something more than just a server," she said, not unkindly. "The question is, how much of what they are has become part of what you are?" Before I could respond, a low humming sound began emanating from the devices surrounding the restaurant. The shimmering field intensified, becoming a visible dome of energy that enclosed the building. 30 seconds, somebody called out. The remaining agents retreated to a safe distance. The captive Gustav struggled against his restraints, his form shifting rapidly as if trying to find a configuration that could break free. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shouted. "The restaurant maintains balance. Without it, they'll come through anyway unregulated, unbound by our rules." 20 seconds. I felt a strange pulling sensation in my chest, like part of me was being drawn toward the restaurant. The agent noticed my discomfort. "What's wrong?" she asked sharply. "I don't know. Something hurts." She barked an order into her communications device, and a moment later, another agent approached with what looked like a medical scanner. He ran it over me, frowning at the readings. "Dimensional tethering," he reported. "Level 3 entanglement." The first agent cursed. "Oh, he's bound to the place more deeply than we thought." 10 seconds. The pulling sensation intensified, becoming painful. I doubled over, feeling as if my insides were being slowly extracted through my pores. "Do something," I pleaded. The medical agent produced a syringe filled with a glowing blue liquid, similar but more vibrant than the medicine that Lydia had given me. "And this is gonna hurt," he warned, and then jabbed the needle directly into my chest. Fire spread through my veins. I screamed, collapsing to my knees, but the pulling sensation began to fade. 5 seconds. 4, 3. Through tear-blurred eyes, I saw the dome of energy contract, squeezing inward like a fist closing. 2, 1. A deafening silence fell, and then the restaurant, the entire building, imploded, folding in on itself until nothing remained but an empty lot where it had once stood. Even the foundation was gone, leaving only bare earth. Gustav gave an inhuman wail of rage and loss before his form collapsed, shrinking down to his more human appearance. The glowing chains still held him, but he no longer fought against them. He looked defeated. As the agents loaded him into a separate vehicle, his black eyes found mine. "You'll never be free of us," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. Once you've served at Gustav's, part of you always remains on the menu. The debriefing lasted days. I told them everything about the rules, the customers, the feast, Mr. Thorne's interest in me. Medical tests confirmed what I had already suspected. My time at the restaurant had changed me. While the good news is the dimensional tethering is fading, Dr. Amanda Willis explained during one of our sessions. She was the DEC's chief medical officer, specializing in humans who had prolonged contact with extra-dimensional entities. The bad news is some changes appear permanent. What kind of changes? I asked, afraid of the answer. Enhanced perception for one. You'll be able to see things that others can't. Glimpses of entities that exist partially in our dimension. Increased sensitivity to emotional states in others. And, she hesitated, you'll likely experience visitations. Visitations. Entities like Mr. Thorne form connections that transcend dimensional barriers. He's found you very nourishing. He may try to continue that relationship. My blood ran cold. But he can't physically harm me, right? Dr. Willis's expression wasn't reassuring. Physical harm isn't really their style, as you've learned, but emotional and psychological harm, well, that's their specialty. The DEC offered me a choice: enter their protection program, which would mean a new identity, relocation, and a job within their organization. A return to my life with some basic training in how to shield myself from extra-dimensional influences. I chose the latter. After months of servitude at Gustav's, the thought of being bound to another organization, even one that claimed to protect humanity, was unbearable. I wanted my freedom, whatever the cost. They gave me specialized medication to take if the symptoms became too intense. They taught me mental exercises to strengthen my psychological barriers. They even installed certain protective measures in my new apartment. Symbols carved into the door frames, a strange metallic powder sprinkled along the windowsills. It won't keep them out entirely, Agent Carter, my main contact, explained, but it'll make it harder for them to manifest fully. When they finally released me, I tried to rebuild my life. I re-enrolled in college, found a normal job at a normal restaurant, and I did my best to pretend that those months at Gustav's had never happened. But at night, when the world grew quiet and the veil between dimensions thinned, I would sometimes awaken to find a familiar oil-like substance seeping under my door, and in my dreams I still served impossible meals to impossible customers, still felt the probing touch of Mr. Thorne's consciousness against mine. One night, about 6 months after the raid, I came home to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with familiar, elegant script. The grand reopening of Gustav's fine dining new location, 0666 Willowwood Lane. Opening night, next full moon. Your presence is requested. Your position awaits. The rules remain the same. G. Below the message was a postscript that made my blood freeze. P.S. Mr. Thorne has expressed how much he misses your particular flavor of fear. He finds your attempt at a normal life deliciously futile. I crumpled the invitation and I threw it in the trash, and then I double-checked all my windows and doors, reapplied the metallic powder where it had worn thin, and swallowed one of the pills that the DEC had given me. That night I dreamed of the restaurant, not as it had been, but as it would be in its new location. In the dream, I walked through dining rooms more elaborate than before, served customers more terrifying than I remembered. And in a corner booth, Mr. Thorne waited, a goblet of swirling blue liquid raised in a toast to my inevitable return. I awoke with a start, my heart hammering, sheets drenched in sweat. On my nightstand, where I was certain nothing had been before, sat a familiar white shirt, black vest, and black pants. my old uniform pressed and ready, and pinned to the vest was a name tag that hadn't been part of my uniform before. It read simply, Bound. I wish I could tell you that I threw the uniform away. I wish I could say I called Agent Carter immediately. I wished I could claim that I was strong enough to resist the pull of Gustav's fine dining. But the truth is, some rules can't be broken. Some agreements once made can't be undone. And some restaurants never really close. They just change locations. So if you're desperate enough to answer a help wanted sign in a grimy window, if you're offered too much money for too little work, if you're handed a list of strange but simple rules, walk away. Run if you can. Because once you've served the monsters, you're always on the menu. And Mr. Thorne is always, always hungry. Damon McCory, Rain, Big Country Allen, Jerry Ramey, Dino, Decky, MP Massacre 91, Nelson Asada, Die Screaming, Meat Gasher, Justin Votenauer, Dalamagara, That One Woodsman, Ty Can't